If perfect, there we go. And then if we can get our speakers, Tiffany and Justine, on the screen. Hello to both of you. I'm so excited to hear both of you speak about building the future of mobility. I will pass the mic to y'all to kick it off, and I'll be in the chat, and I'll look forward to hearing more in the Q&A part.
Sounds good. Thanks so much. And thank you for having us. Tiffany, I know I'm super excited about this conversation. And I'll just do a quick introduction, then I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself to everyone. So good afternoon and good evening and good night to those who may be watching all around the world. My name is Justine. I would probably say a mobility enthusiast. I didn't really realize I would be into this space, but I guess this is kind of the path that I am on and really enjoying every bit of it. I wear a number of different hats. One, I am based in Los Angeles, California, where I'm born and raised. I also have the pleasure of having great experiences in New York City, where I worked for about 8 years in the transportation space, including all things from taxis to ferries. So, I understand the ground transportation and the maritime transportation service and offerings. Now I am back in my home state of California, home city of Los Angeles, where I serve with the California Mobility Center, based in California as well, really thinking about all things around electrification. I also serve as a commissioner for the Los Angeles County Board of Aviation, and really thinking about all things around how we move people and goods in airspace as well. So that's super exciting. And I also teach a class at USC specifically on this topic. So it's always exciting. And I get to have the pleasure to dialogue with so many of my students every single week about what we think about the future of transportation, and really staying current and up to speed on these topics. So I'm super happy to be here. And that's enough about me. Tiffany, I will turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you. Also super excited to be here. Thank you to CoSensus for even inviting, me to participate in this chat. This is amazing work that you do. So my name is Tiffany Garcia. I am from Glastonbury, Connecticut. I currently work for the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority as their Title VI specialist. I started in transportation in 2015 at the Connecticut Department of Transportation, also working in Title VI and environmental justice. So working in both roles on identifying public engagement techniques, monitoring transit services for equity, for minority versus non-minority routes. And I'm also the secretary of the Conference of Minority Transportation Officials, where we come up with different programming to try to recruit more minorities and females into the transportation space. So excited to start this conversation.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, I guess we could just kick it off. I would love, and I love the two prompts that folks were responding to. I think the commentary that you all provided was really, really great. And I think agreed, like +1 on so many of those comments. But I guess, Tiffany, just in terms of like your opinion on what is the future of the future of mobility, let's just take it all the way back. Like, what do you think this future looks like? I have some thoughts about it, but what do you think?
Yeah, no. And, seconding, your sentiments on the comments that were coming in, I'm sure we'll touch on all of that, but all of that, totally resonated with me. This is a super exciting time in transportation. It's been offering us a lot of opportunity to reevaluate how we approach transit planning with all these rapidly emerging and evolving technologies. We have this opportunity to expand and improve our current service options in ways that I think we haven't seen in a long time. And it's really, and I think someone said this earlier, transforming the way that we travel from point A to point B. So when we think of mobility now, we aren't just thinking about bus and rail, we're thinking about ride share, e-scooters, bike share. So just really expanding those options. And then simultaneously, there's this growing and greater emphasis on equity, and including, by way of funding opportunities and federal reporting requirements. This current administration with like Justice 40 and, the executive order 13985, I think it is not just encouraging transit providers and, state DOTs to invest and implement equity, but actually requiring, some of these investments and implementation activities. So ideally, this focus on equity, coinciding with these emerging technologies will ideally bring us into a time where our services are more equitable, and that are, not only more equitable for the future, but also will address past transportation decisions, that have harmed especially some of our most vulnerable communities. And, now in 2023, it's hard not to talk about the future of mobility without looking at our most recent past and thinking about the impacts that COVID-19 have had on how we look at transportation, how we're impacted by transportation, and how some of our transportation decisions have impacted communities. So I think, it's like a perfect storm, of all these three things coinciding. And I think it just offers us this amazing, unique opportunity if we take advantage of it. And ideally we will. And from what I've seen throughout the industry, it looks like, various providers and states are taking advantage of this opportunity to really reevaluate how we look at transit, who we're impacting with transit, and how we can, make people more mobile.
Yeah. No, I love that. And it's also making me think, when I think about the future of mobility, I think we're now having or we should be having a conversation about intentional design. And I think for so many communities, we have suffered, and specifically low-income communities of color have really suffered from just so many injustices. When we talk about environmental racism, when we talk about redlining, we talk about all of these different barriers that have been put up in communities. Now I think the process is really being, how do we become more thoughtful about design? How do we think about where people are going and how they're getting there? How do we have this conversation that's not just only linear to like one mode or one mode versus another, but really like, how do we create this full ecosystem and ensure that it is holistic to really move people and goods? Because I think the pandemic also put light on that as well, of when you don't have access or you don't have ways in which your goods can get to you efficiently and effectively, you start to feel that impact when you talk about scarcity at grocery stores, right? And you see prices changing and all of that. And so I think the future of mobility does really exist in a world where we're being thoughtful about how we're designing these systems or redesigning systems. How do we think about inclusivity? How do we think about taking time to acknowledge that, like, there are communities that still live in transit deserts that still to this day, we could talk about biking all day long in other modes, but they literally don't even have public transportation that can get to them. And so I think this future world is something where we really start to like take into consideration the past injustices, but also making sure that like access is a big piece, right? Because so many people are cut off. So yeah, I think this is going to be a big part about this full process and plan, and how might innovation be used to really connect communities in a very different way. So that's just, I guess, my quick take on that.
Yeah, no, and I love, what you said there about, this intentional design, and really focusing on the needs of the community, and every community's needs are going to be different, so we can have different services offered in, you can have a region that have access to, let's say, like bike share or something. But if you have a community that's not their mode of choice at the time, maybe there's interest, maybe there's geographical barriers, that infrastructure barriers that don't allow them to do that. So having access and then equal choice to use the system, the different modes, so yeah, maybe you have access to rail, but the fares are unaffordable. So you don't have the choice to use that, so just really making every mode, equally available.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, I'd love to hear your thoughts too, as it relates to like micromobility, because I know mobility, broadly speaking, includes a lot of different vehicle form factors. When I say vehicle form factors, anything that has a wheel. So that's what when I say vehicle form factors. But what do you think about, micromobility is such a hot topic, can say across the United States and as well as world at this point. What do you think about the role of micromobility and how it will play into the future of mobility?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has and it will continue to play a huge role. Some of these services offer us, these options outside of traditional public transportation services that we can use, as additional services or to supplement those already existing services. So whether it be, to help bridge gaps in actual service or in timing, scheduling, off-peak commuting. I think those are all great choices for that. I think it's important though, I think, and kind of almost going back to what you were saying about being intentional, not just throwing all these services into a community without establishing some equity goals, like really talking to the community about what these different options are. It's important to like fully consider and proactively address, any potential harms or lack of access. So we need to understand how these options will realistically expand transportation options for these underserved groups, not just having it available, just having it available isn't necessarily going to make people more mobile. There's tons of things that you have to, address, whether it be like the geographic distribution or economic challenges with some of these, services. And limits in awareness or interest or so I think they're great, and I think we need to embrace them and leverage them, but I think maintaining that equity lens, as we like approach them. So
yeah, I think I agree with you. And every time, it's funny, every time I think about micromobility, I often say it's not a new concept, right? Like, it's like, I think we put so much on like, this is a new thing. And it's like, no, people have really been moving on bicycles. People have used wagons to carry their goods to, people have made shift wagons to take goods to and from. So it's not a new concept in many ways. I just think that, people know that they need to connect from point A to point B. And so they have figured out organically, and you can go to, again, a number of different countries and see this in real time, right? So it's like, it's always interesting to me when people are like, oh, it's a new concept. I'm like, no, it's not. People have been doing this. I think, again, the only thing that is truly new about micromobility is that we have the power of innovation attached to it, right? So like now we have our cell phones that can literally start to say, okay, I can, use my phone to help me think about a full trip plan. And that trip plan might include something like a shared bike or a shared scooter, something like that. So I think that's where it's been new, and it's formalized a behavior that has already informally been happening for a while. So, I think I just like to call that and name that behavior out, because I always think it's not new. It's not new to the future. We've been doing it in the past. I think the only thing formal about it is that we've attached technology and data and innovation to this. And I also think we're now thinking about how micromobility now is integrated into a larger mobility ecosystem, including mass transportation, including other modes of getting around. So I think that formality has now been put to the forefront, and many cities are seeing, okay, well, how do you reduce emissions? And really, you got to think about what are those car trips that happen between 1 to 3 miles? And do people really have other ways of getting around, or is it just a car? And then I also think too, again, to your point, when we think about different communities have different needs, right? And it's, and I say when we have to talk about intentionality about design, just because you have a bike lane does not necessarily mean that it feels safe to ride a bike, right? And not everyone can ride a bike. And so I like to call out that there are other ways in which we can still think about micromobility. And again, we're seeing even sidewalk delivery devices. If you're in city of Santa Monica, you may see these little robots moving around, taking people's, Grubhub meals or Seamless or Uber Eats food, et cetera. So you're seeing some of this now, but, I always say that the infrastructure is always a big part of this, but also the people. Do people feel safe doing this? Is another thing I always like to think about in terms of the future of mobility. And I hope that we can start to think a lot more about the safety and the experience that people have. It's one thing to drop a bunch of like bikes and scooters in a neighborhood and say people ride them. It's another thing, are the speed limits at a level where I would feel comfortable riding next to a bike. If I don't, I'm not doing it, right? And I can know how to ride a bike with my eyes closed, but I'm not going to do it if it feels like that. So, I think there's, again, I think between design and between access, and technology and innovation, I think micromobility is going to be and continue to be a big part of this larger transportation network and mobility ecosystem.
Yeah, and I totally agree with everything you said. And then I think also, I think I see a lot more partnership between, government agencies and these micromobility service providers or transit authorities. I think about not too long ago in Boston, they shut down the Orange Line for about a month to handle some safety improvements. And that was a huge part of the transportation options that were being offered, to replace, some of the Orange Line riders' needs. And, they were offering e-bikes for free for the entire month for the city, all residents of the city of Boston. So you do see a lot more partnership, I think, between specific like transit providers and these micromobility providers. Which is great. And I think it's necessary because, like you said, it goes back to looking at the transportation system holistically and not looking at everything so siloed,
Yeah, completely agree with you. And yes, the role of the private sector, sorry, I have a friend who loves to be on Zoom. The role of the private sector on top of that, as well as, you're starting to see more integration between public and private sector. I guess with that being said, and with that in mind, like, let's talk a little bit about like transit equity and, what do you think makes transit services equitable? Like what could that look like? Or just love to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So then this was one of the prompts too, where I especially loved everyone's, in the chat. I think everybody was spot on. I think, transit equity it's safe, it's convenient, affordable, and accessible transportation for all, and I think a big part of transit equity is, and I think we talk about this a lot, especially, those who are involved in transportation equity, the difference between equity and equal, and equitable and equal. And I think just recognizing the different needs, of different communities or the different barriers within different communities. I think that's a huge part, understanding them and then acknowledging them and then making efforts to mitigate or eliminate them. That's all a huge part, in my opinion, of transportation equity. And then as far as like, what makes transit services equitable? Again, I think it goes back to that community needs, understanding what the access needs are in one community compared to another. Then there's quality of service, so you may have rail and bus available and throughout a region, but if certain communities are having a different customer experience using those services, then in my opinion, that those transit services aren't equitable, even though they have access, whether it be comfort, like you've mentioned a couple times, safety, convenience, different fares, affordability. So understanding that, and that's actually part of the work that Title VI requires, is looking at your services and examining the quality of service, so identifying different standards for your scheduling, your on-time performance, your load factor, how many people you can have on a bus or a rail or a train to make it comfortable, and then looking at the differences in your community, your routes that are serving your communities of color versus non-communities of color, and ensuring that those quality that quality of service is equitable. And then I would also say our investments, making sure that our investments are equitable. There's always been overinvestment in highway and infrastructure. And I think that I'm not minimizing that. That is just as important, especially as we start embracing these other modes of biking. We're encouraging walking, these healthier modes of transportation. That infrastructure investment is important, but our public transportation system has been underinvested and for so long. So, really kind of rectify, making intentional investments to kind of rectify that.
I totally agree with you. I often think about this question a lot, and because again, we hear equity a lot more in conversation, especially around transportation and mobility. And again, I think and I love how you started with the definition in terms of saying equity and equality, not the same thing. Those are two different things. And sometimes I think people, probably might interchange the two or may think they're exactly the same, especially when we think about transportation. And I really been thinking about this a lot. And I really think like an equitable transit service looks like something that does liberate the human journey, right? Like, I think it's about like true liberation through and through. And do I feel, and again, I'm someone who's very big on the experience that people have, is my experience on said mode the same as someone's experience in another place? And oftentimes, even when we think about public transportation, we often find, that's not true. Like this community, their wait times are much longer, or this community, the buses that are being dispatched here might be older, or maybe they're not up to date. Like all of those pieces are important. I also think, again, when we talk about connectivity, like, can people get to where they really need to go? And I think, transportation planners historically have done a lot of transportation planning from an ivory tower, right? And never really like talking to people and figuring out where they need to go. And if they've just been focused, and this is where I kind of like, I think data is important. However, there's stuff that your data just doesn't tell you because maybe the designer never thought to ask those questions, right? And so I think it's like, let's expand our reach and let's really think about connectivity. I'm very big on safety as well, and I'll talk about this too. I think the feeling of being safe on transportation is a part of an equitable system, right? Does someone who identifies as a woman, or does a young girl, or do children feel safe on said system? Do they feel like they can navigate? Do they feel like they can still access, whether that's school, whether that's work, whether that's home? Like, what does this feeling feel like? And I think it's really about kind of this full, again, like way of looking at this from the level of access, from the level of connectivity, from the level of safety. But I also think it is like really spending time with a lot of communities that still live with the impacts and the realities of redlining, right? We still live with the impacts of economic divestment in communities. We think about even what communities get their potholes fixed faster versus not, right? Like all of this is a part of this conversation around transportation equity and transit equity. And I just, it's one thing to talk about service, but I'm very big of like, yes, we need equitable service, but we also need equitable infrastructure. We need equity when we talk about safety. We need to talk about environmental justice. Like all of those are very important to me. And I think those points should be had when we talk about realizing a future where transportation is fully equitable. And again, I think, I've been really kind of watching how things have been happening. I know like Kansas City has been looking at, or is doing free fares. I know LA Metro did free fares as well, but like the cost and the cost burden of transportation should not prohibit you from utilizing transportation. So when we think about equity, and we know that, low income folks spend a large majority of their earnings on transportation, whether that's gas, whether that's public transit. And so how do we start to get to a point and to a place where cost does not become a barrier, or cost changes one's quality of life, right? And so like, I think, we do have to break down the economics and really understand that, yes, like acknowledging that communities, and typically, again, when I call out like low income communities, communities of color, et cetera, who might be spending a lot of their earnings on just getting to work. And like that changes your whole quality of life, like your whole ability to to be in a space of joy, in a space of peace, going to work, and even your ability when something happens, can you still get to said place? Like, is there redundancy within this transportation network that allows you to have real options? Because if you don't, I think we'll continue to have kind of the tale of two transportation networks, right? Like the ones that feel really connected and the ones that are just like, here's the bare minimum. And I'd love for every community to feel, here's what, here's the full experience and here's the full menu of options available to you, and being really thoughtful about how people are experiencing that system mentally, emotionally, and more. So that's my like long-winded, probably like very detailed answer about what I
No,
think
and
about.
I love that. And I love that you specifically called out mentally and emotionally, because I don't think those come up as often when we talk about this work, but that impact, not having access or having the stress of transportation is definitely going to impact your mental health and your emotional health, and that's just insane. Like it's ridiculous that that's to be that it is that way right now, but
yeah, no, I'm with you on that. And I guess, since we're on this again topic around equitable transit and really this pathway towards liberation or like economic mobility for communities, how would this look like, especially particularly for those like communities that have been historically underserved? Like, how do you think this might actually happen?
Yeah. So I think it would be, offering opportunities, that or expanded opportunities to employment. I think that would be a huge one, and not offering access to employment and then charging a fare that's more than they're making, per hour, where they're spending more money going to work than they are, working. So, expanding access to jobs. I love this idea, that you brought up and that it's a hot topic now, I think, within the industry of free fares. I know Boston has selected 3 routes, primarily minority serving routes, and they're free for the next 2 years as a pilot. And I'm hopeful that more cities and transit providers kind of, use that as a model, because I think it establishes transportation more as a public right, than as a perk, and we all need access to public transportation. So I'm hoping that that's something that gains momentum and becomes more the norm than not. And then, when you have that, it just like you said, there's this transportation burden cost that's high and for so many people. And so eliminating that and at the same time offering access to better employment, I think can really help, forge this path towards like liberation and economic mobility.
Yeah. I mean, and it's so interesting because I'm often like, I think you get to dream differently about your life when you have true like mobility and when you're focusing on equity and you're focusing on access and all of these different parts and pieces. I think you get to dream about what your future looks like, and you get to dream about what your present looks like, right? So I think it's all of those different things. Like you get to think about what job you're going to get and I think this is a challenge now is like, okay, you can't afford to live in the downtown area, but then you got to push yourself out to the suburbs. So you're stuck in either traffic or you're stuck with like multiple connections of how to get to work. It's not as easy as you would think. And so like, what would it feel like if people had the real power of choice, right? Like you get to choose now, you get to choose where you want to work. You get to choose the communities that you live in, and not to say like, I have to live in said community because if not, I'm not going to get to work. I'm not going to get my kids on to school on time. And again, and some of that choice you don't get to make because, again, when we think about land use and the way in which we connect transportation and housing and our places of employment, I think we're seeing that shaking up a lot. I'm not going to say for everyone, because again, I think, the pandemic did expose that there are some people who literally, they don't have the luxury of doing what we're doing, of having a call from our convenience of our home, or getting on a computer, or even having access to the internet. And so I think it's like, I think for many people, when we start to really prioritize liberating the human journey, you do give people a chance to breathe, and you give them a chance to dream. And I think that's something that I'd hope that we get to do. And I want to acknowledge that, like, you know, I think the cost and the proximity of transportation really does, it really does constrain how you move through space and time. It really does define, can I really do this, I don't know, after school class that I really want to do? Or is that just gonna, like, does my last, whether that's train, taxi, whomever, like, not provide service after said time? So I think we have to get back to the public right and the public good of transportation, rather than, again, to your point, not it being a perk or a specific, like, here's something that's a nice to add, but it's something that everyone should have access to. And everyone should be able to, again, feel like they're able to, again, get the educational or career choice that they would like, and really think about that in terms of having economic mobility justice, and especially taking that lens for communities. So I think I'm excited about how communities might be able to gain the power of choice from there.
That too, I think as a society overall, we underestimate how valuable our time is, our time, like, I thought of that when you were talking about sitting in traffic, or if you have, your only job opportunity is an hour away, route, each way by, taking 2 different buses and, light rail or something, like, that's time, and that's very valuable. And I think we underestimate that a lot. So,
Yeah, I'd even love to, like, even if we started to reevaluate, like, state minimum wages and just minimum wages in general, like, your minimum wage should not just be like, again, based on census data about, like, I think we need to be really intentional about, like, does minimum wage also factor in the cost of transportation, the cost of maintaining the roads, the cost of offering different lines and services, micromobility, and more? Is all of that included when we have this conversation about thinking about a minimum wage?
Yeah.
And is that, again, something that we might start to see shifting towards really thinking about a world where there are free fares, and how do we build into that as some type of subsidized service? Because transportation is subsidized already. Let's think about a way in which we can really level that up. And again, for employers that want to locate in a certain community, neighborhood, et cetera, great, but you're gonna, also be a part of the transportation operations and maintenance process as well. But that being said, I was gonna say, like, what do you think that I guess for mobility leaders, what do you think that they need to take on in terms of engaging with communities? Like, what role do you think that mobility leaders should have in this conversation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think anyone involved in the transportation space has some role, in engaging our communities. And I think I'm hopeful, and we seem to be trending this way, where we're approaching engagement as less of a check the box exercise and something that's a little bit more intentional. I think we're getting away from the days of just holding like one public informational meeting or hearing and expecting, people to come, and we have our plan, and it's, like, all right, we did our job, and I think we're, like I said, we're trending more in the direction of intentional engagement, meeting communities where they are, establishing relationships with community leaders, community-based organizations, leveraging those resources and those relationships. I think we can, as an industry, get a little bit, even still, there's always room for improvement. And I think reaching out to communities, more often than outside of like a specific project or a specific plan, and just going to them and say, okay, what's your, like, to your point, like, what is your experience right now, and where are the barriers? How can we improve that experience? So not going there with a set of ideas or a set plan, but coming out with them, based on the specific community's needs. So I'm hopeful that that's kind of the direction that we're heading. And like I said, I do see it more, but I think that's always an area where we can improve upon.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I love that in terms of it's not just only mobility leaders who get to hold the mic, right? Like everybody gets to hold the mic. And I don't need to, again, take someone else's voice. They can use the power that they have. I don't, so essentially I think I love that in terms of we can get to a point as mobility, whoever considers himself as a mobility leader, to also take the mic and actually share that space with others, to use their voice and to honor those pieces of information that people are sharing with you. Those stories that they have, those experiences are very real. It's actually funny because I used to serve as co-chair for an organization called Black Space Urbanist Collective. And there's a manifesto that Black Space has, and I would encourage anyone who's in like urban planning, architecture, design, it doesn't even matter. You can just I think as a person, you should just have it somewhere. But essentially the manifesto has like 14 principles. And I try to look at the manifesto pretty much daily, before I even think about work. And there's a principle that always sticks out to me is really like, be a humble learner who practices deep listening. And so when we think about engaging with communities, again, this role of who is the leader or who is the expert, like, no, let's actually humble ourselves to listen and to learn from what communities are sharing. And let's not go in with the assumption that I went to such and such school and I have this degree and the data has shown all of the above. And let's again, practice the act of humility and just being humble. Knowing that communities have lived here. It's kind of like if you go to any place in the world where you see people who are, it's kind of like if you try to build a house in a location, let's say a tropical location, and a community member can tell you, don't build your house there. And you're like, there's no water. What are you talking about? And then the rainy season happens and the house is gone. And you're like, how did they know that? Because they've lived through that experience. They know where you can put a house and where you can't, right? And so it's that same level of, being humble and really being able to listen and connect with people. Because again, the data doesn't tell you everything. It's insightful and it has a lot, but what might those pieces of information, those outliers, get us to another point? So that's always my big thing too. Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to know too, and I know we're almost at time, so I'll probably maybe ask you one more question, or we could talk about one more thing, but really, really wanted to know what do you think the responsibility that mobility leaders or advocates should have, especially when it comes to the conversation around community health and public health, specifically within transportation and mobility?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, an important question, and something, again, that COVID, shed a light on just how impacted, residents, especially who were in these heavy transit corridors, more susceptible to asthma and then more susceptible to these airborne, illnesses. So it's such an important question. And I think it's important that I don't think, I think we can look more at the intersection between health and transportation, which I don't think is done, as often as it probably should be. And taking a multi-sector approach, I think working with departments of public health, along with, transportation folks, kind of all working together, and identifying, solutions that aren't just Band-Aids, but identifying, how these are all impacting each other, and how we can come up with solutions through a multi-sector approach, like I said, to kind of, lessen these burdens, these public health burdens.
Yeah, I mean, it's so, I love when you talked about even the intersections between transportation and public health, mental health, there's so many points in where I would love, and again, I think maybe this is a part of that question of what might transit equity look like? How might we start to even think about, the public health piece and the community health piece? How do we start to think about, the ways in which I personally believe that, you can't have a conversation about community health without having a conversation about the built environment and the way in which people move, right? Are people, if you're living next to a freeway, you probably have a high percentage of people who have asthma and other respiratory related illnesses. If you have a high number of people who are, large numbers of folks in a community who are suffering with diabetes or with obesity, you probably can connect that to something around the built environment, whether that's transportation. Do people have actually room to walk? Is the neighborhood safe, in terms of thinking about walking? Is it something where it's adequately lit? And when I talk about safety, I'm just saying, like, visually, can I go outside and see where I need to go? Or is it like, I don't even know because it's so dark. Like, I feel like I'm right. So, like, does it feel like that or does it not? And so I think we need to, have these conversations when we think about public health and community health as relates to mobility. And again, air quality and more. I'm someone who does like to imagine or really think about the future. And I think, another important part to this conversation around community health is really like, how might we start to use transportation and technology and innovation to bring better health, whether that's health resources, clinics, et cetera, to people. Because oftentimes you hear, well, the hospitals are too far, that's why people don't go. And it's like, okay, well, that answer should not just be, like, we'll keep going about our day. How do we think about ways in which vehicles now could be used in terms of being mobile health clinic? Can you do some pre-screening? Can those mobile health clinics go to different communities, especially communities where the data shows you, that you might have about, again, all of the different health impacts that people are having? If you could start to do pre-screened work there, again, blood pressure monitoring. I'm not a health professional, but I'm sure there are like things that you can do before you actually have to go to a hospital. Like, can we think about ways in which that's done? And even when we think about like hot summer days, and people, I think, people forget that heat strokes are real. Like, if you're walking around on the street and you've been carrying groceries, you're getting on the bus, you're getting on the train, it's hot. And like, how do we think about even like mobile water stations? Are people able to access just water, or is that, I don't think people, I don't know, I feel like, how do we think about mobility and transportation in a way where we can also say, instead of just like people connecting, how do we bring some of those resources to people as well? So I'm always thinking about like, what does this future look like if we were to invest in our mobility system this way, and really think about, again, people as part of this broader conversation around public health. And again, public health also includes, again, back to safety. Do people fear their lives, right? And if they do fear their lives, I'm very big on like, let's not over enforce spaces, but let's create spaces where people do feel safe. And, how might mobility contribute to that? And how might the future of vehicles look like? I'm not saying, so yeah, anyways, I'll get off my soapbox from there, but yeah.
I love it.
Always thinking
All
about
great points. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I was going to say, I know if we're happy to ask more questions, we can turn it back over to the audience. I do want to make sure, I'm looking at time here. I know we could talk for hours, so I just want to make sure if audience members had some questions for us, just wanted to create some space for that as well.
Thank you both. I'm actually going to jump in because I had a few questions come up during this. And first off, I want to thank you both for having such an honest, transparent conversation about mobility, transit. I think there's so many things that came up in it that kind of I think about on a daily basis, or I talk to like the folks who work with Team Social Labs on building consensus. I talk to them about. So I wanted to throw a couple of questions y'all's way. Also for the audience, if there are any questions, please feel free to drop them in our Q&A and we can get to those. One of the things that I heard come up several times was the word liberation. And I think that so many times I have thought about, and I've heard like, liberation really looks like the ability to dream. And so when you said that, it just really resonated. What is, and I would love to hear from both of you, what is that missing piece? Like, we have that idea, we know what liberation can look like. We know that's like, the evolution of this equity process that we want to get to. But then there's your day-to-day as like a planner, or a transit planner or someone who's working at an agency. So like, what is the missing gap between getting to that point in your day-to-day? And like, how can you, even if you have examples of like other cities or institutions that have done it, how can you slowly but surely try to like get there? And I know that's a giant question, but I'm just curious to hear y'all's thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, happy to start first. I think I think we have to acknowledge the barriers, right? Which are for many folks who are working transportation, especially if you work within the context of city government, there's the bureaucracy and the red tape, right? It's like, okay, community engagement does not move at the speed of trust, right? It just doesn't. It's just like, and that's a Black space principle as well, but it doesn't. It's just like, we have to get this project approved before said mayor or said elected official, whether that's city, state, federal, it has to get done, right? Or the funding has to get there. And so again, when you operate in a context like that, it is hard to really think about dreaming because that takes time, right? And again, to get people into the room, to get them to the point where like they're comfortable, because again, we're having conversations about transportation, knowing that there are people literally who are like stuck literally in every sense of the word. They cannot move freely, whether they are someone who has the challenge of, again, someone who's like, there's only one bus line, or maybe there's not a bus line. Maybe there's just the one road. And if the road is flooded, I can't go to work. Or maybe it's someone who uses a wheelchair or a walker. And it's like, I got to wait for that one excessive ride, whatever excess service that comes to me. And so that prevents you, I think, from dreaming and really having a system of liberation, because there's time, the constraint of time, or the heaviness of time prevents, I think, in many ways, planners who do want to approach the work intentionally with that challenge. So I think that's one thing. I think, how do you overcome that? I think even if we started to even look at projects, not as this like, maybe we got to get this big capital construction project done, but let's think about certain pieces of that project, right? And what are some of the, like, if it's a phased approach, let's look at what phase one might look like. And can we start to build in more of those, can we start to build in more time as it relates to working with communities on the design of said transportation program? Maybe that could be one option again, and maybe there's a certain area of this particular project. I mean, I remember being in New York City and working on projects, and I'd hear things from communities and I'm like, wait, guys, did we take that into consideration? And you get to a point where you're like, wait, I don't think we actually or we went to 2 meetings, but that third meeting, someone said something that I haven't heard before. I need to unpack that a little bit. I need some time with that so I can figure out how this might be impacting the way we're rolling out a new service and a new system. And I've been, I will say I've been fortunate to work on teams where people have given me that grace and that space to do that. That's not the case for everyone, I will say. And again, every project is not like that. And maybe there's some projects that it's like, no, we can't give you that time. But when you get the opportunity for it, I think you should always ask. And I think you should always push to get it.
Yeah, no, and I love that, just this concept of having the time, taking a breath. Sometimes I think we just, like you said, we have these deadlines, we want to get things done, and we don't recognize though that not having that meaningful engagement, or not, talking to the community or reaching out to them and engaging them, it could actually delay our project, or they could come up with an idea that could make our project move faster, and so I think that's so important. And then I think also just being honest, with the public, acknowledging the limitations, like you said, of your resources, of time, of, whatever it is, and kind of going out there and being honest about what you can offer and what you can't, and being honest about why you can't offer certain things, or, and not just quickly saying no, because maybe for another project you couldn't, obviously taking that back and just making sure that that's not something that's achievable, but then following up, and having that dialogue and saying, okay, we can't do this, but maybe we can do this, and just a lot more compromise, transparency and compromise, I think.
Can make it work. Yeah. It's a hard and difficult balance. And I admire y'all for really being there's, it's almost like trying to stick your foot in the door and just keep wedging it open bit by bit, and just being I'm gonna I'm going to try every way possible. I have one more question, and then I think we'll close out. And this question, I know like some of our audience may have a similar related thing, but one of my favorite quotes is, and I might mangle it because I don't have it verbatim, but like Audre Lorde's quote about, we can't change the system with the oppressor's tools. And so thinking of all these like bureaucratic tools that we may be confined by, knowing that a lot of these tools were made with a lack of intention, or perhaps some intention that is oftentimes malicious and inequitable, and knowing that a lot of people who are trying to do the work that y'all are talking about, liberation, equity, are working with those tools. What are recommended tools and resources y'all have for planners, folks in mobility to go to, even if it's just a website with resources? I know we mentioned Black Space is a great one. Are there other ones that can be helpful for our audience as they're thinking through, like, man, how can I do some of this work, or start to integrate some of this work, or even like frameworks into what I'm doing on a daily basis?
Yeah, again, I a big fan of Black Space's manifesto. I think there's a lot of unlearning, right? And I think we have to acknowledge that, to your point, the tools that we were given, again, who were they created by, who were they created for or without? And I think, it starts there, being at a space where you can actually take some time to say, I don't know it all. And I don't know if the things that were actually taught in a formalized environment were the right tools. And there are many tools at your disposal. Again, I think we probably have a hard time thinking outside of the box, because community engagement has looked like a town hall meeting. A community engagement has looked like all of these things, right? But imagine a world, and I think it's pushing ourselves to reimagine how we talk to people, how we connect with people, how we see the built environment. We give a lot of credit to the planning for founders. I don't even know if that's the right term to call them, but like, people were here before they were like that. There were civilizations here. People were moving before, but we give credit to, person A and person B, and, we put so much praise towards them without acknowledging that people have been moving any place in the world. That's been the nature of human beings. We have been moving since we were created on earth, right? Like, we have not just settled in one space. And I think about that a lot. And not to say that's a tool, but I often use that to remind myself that I don't need a theorist or whoever came up with, like, whoever is like the leading planning person of the time to tell me how I think community engagement should be, because as a human being, I can tell certain things based on my experiences and what other people experience. So I just use that as my North Star, or my guide in many ways, of like, people were here before this theory came up, like before that. So like, acknowledge that feeling and talk to people and know how they move. So I don't have the full list of things, and I'll think about some more resources by y'all. I'll email you all and share those with you, but this is just kind of at my top of the head moment.
Yeah, no, I think those are great. And I think also just, leveraging each other, we're all in this space together, and we all have, different experiences, different experience working with, on different types of projects or plans, or with different communities. And so really networking, within the industry, and creating a network of like-minded, equity focused professionals, and really just leveraging those resources.
For sure. Well, I want to thank both of y'all so much. You're both gems. You both drop gems for us today. And I just want to say we appreciate everything you have to say. We appreciate your time. Thank you both. We're going to start closing out the event. So I want to also thank the audience. What I also want to let y'all know is that we are thinking through so many of these things that Justine and Tiffany mentioned, talking about liberation, talking about equity. These are things we internally talk about on our team. While Transit Equity Day was February 4th, so it was a few days back, we are honoring that by hosting this event and honoring that space, also by dropping a new co-census lesson in the next in the next few weeks that's going to be focused on an introduction to transit equity. For anyone in the audience who doesn't know, we have content that are like 45-minute to 1 hour long kind of online workshops that you're able to watch, engage with. We have a few and they're currently under the website or URL collab. But we're going to actually be bringing that over into our co-census product so you can engage with that content. Fun fact for everyone to know, Tiffany's going to be the one hosting that introduction to transit equity. So we're so excited for that. Created by Tiffany Garcia, this lesson is going to be focused on defining transit equity, its importance, while also identifying strategies that you can all implement in your own work to move transportation equity forward. I'm super excited to have you all here, super excited to announce that James just dropped the link in the chat. If you want to be among the first to get access to that course, all you have to do is sign up for co-census, and to get access to that, you can click that link, sign up, and try co-census at no cost, and then get access to that lesson. With that being said, I want to thank everyone again. I want to thank Justine and Tiffany. I want to thank our attendees. And of course, I want to thank our team for putting this amazing event together. It's always a pleasure to have conversations, especially about equity and liberation and how to move the needle forward. Thank you all, and I wish you a wonderful good night, and we look forward to staying connected with you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.